South Pacific, 1820, an American whaling ship called Essex is on a hunting expedition when a male sperm whale, approximately 85 feet long, emerges from the fog, swims directly toward the hull and collides with the ship twice. The Essex sinks. Out of the 20 men on board, 8 survive after 93 days drifting across the ocean. And they survive because they ate the ones who died first. This is the most documented event, but it was not the only one. And the question 19th century sailors began asking in hushed voices, because saying it out loud sounded insane, was whether some whales were doing it on purpose. To understand what may have happened, it is necessary to understand what a sperm whale is. It is the largest toothed predator ever documented. Adult males can reach 60 feet and weigh up to 60 tons. It has the largest brain of any animal that has ever existed, approximately 18 pounds. With a highly developed neocortex that supports complex social structures, sophisticated communication, and documented long-term memory. It dives more than 6,000 feet deep in search of giant squid, holding its breath for up to 90 minutes. It navigates the ocean using echolocation, sound pulses that map the environment in 3 dimensions, with enough precision to locate prey in complete darkness hundreds of feet away. Sperm whales live in matrilineal groups, females and calves together, with young males eventually leaving to live in bachelor groups before becoming solitary in adulthood. These groups have distinct cultures, clique dialects that vary between populations just as languages vary between human communities. Calves learn the dialect of their group. Groups from different regions of the ocean have different sound repertoires that researchers identify and catalog. In terms of cognitive and social capacity, the sperm whale is one of the most complex animals on Earth, and that detail is important for what came next. Commercial sperm whale hunting began in the early 18th century and reached industrial scale in the 19th century. Sperm whale oil was the most valuable product of the ocean, used in lamps, industrial machine lubricants, and candle production. Spermaceti, a waxy substance found in the organ inside the animal's head, was used in cosmetics and precision lubricants. The ivory teeth had decorative value. A single adult sperm whale was worth a fortune. 19th century whaling ships spent 2 to 3 years at sea on each voyage. They operated among whale groups, harpooned the animals, pulled them alongside the ship, and processed them in open waters. The process was violent, loud, and produced enormous amounts of blood and fat that saturated the area for days. For an animal with the auditory sophistication of a sperm whale, capable of detecting sounds from dozens of miles away, of identifying the specific sounds of family groups, of distinguishing sound patterns with extraordinary precision, a whaling ship in operation was a source of detailed acoustic information. The sounds of the whaleboat oars, the impact of the harpoon, the sounds of other injured sperm whales, all of it created a specific and recognizable sound pattern. Modern researchers of animal behavior have documented that cetaceans in regions of intense hunting modify their behavior in ways that suggest a learned response to the presence of vessels. Sperm whales in 19th century hunting regions began displaying behaviors that sailors of the time described in diaries and testimonies as different from the animals they had encountered during the first years of each route. Mocha Dick was an albino male sperm whale that operated in the waters off Mocha Island in Chile, approximately between 1810 and 1838. White albino, visible from distances where other sperm whales would be invisible in the fog. There was no way to mistake it for another animal. The records about Mocha Dick come from sailors' diaries, captains' reports, and an article published in Knickerbocker magazine in 1839 by Jeremiah Reynolds, who collected testimonies from sailors who had encountered the animal. What these reports have in common becomes disturbing once you begin to notice the pattern. Mocha Dick did not flee. In most reported encounters, the sperm whale responded to attacks from the whaleboats by turning around and attacking back. This was not universal behavior among sperm whales. Most hunted animals tried to escape, dove underwater, and swam at maximum speed away from the ship. Mocha Dick attacked the whaleboats. The reports describe the animal crushing vessels with its jaw, striking with its tail, and swimming directly toward the boats. Reynolds collected reports of approximately 100 encounters with Mocha Dick over several decades, and in 28 of those encounters the animal was described as initiating or responding with direct attacks against the vessels. The reports identified the same animal by its unique white coloration in incidents separated by years and involving different hunting crews. Mocha Dick had scars from previous harpoons, iron marks, an animal that had survived multiple attacks over many years and that responded to new attacks differently from animals that had never gone through that experience. The case of the Essex is the most documented because George Pollard, the captain, and Owen Chase, the first mate, survived and wrote independent accounts that were published. Chase published his account in 1821, 1 year after the sinking. Pollard gave interviews that were recorded by other captains and by the writer who would later use the case as the basis for Moby Dick decades afterward. The Essex was operating approximately 2,000 nautical miles west of the Galapagos Islands when the sperm whale appeared. Chase described the animal as unusually large, estimated at 85 feet long, significantly above the average for males of the species. He described the animal briefly stopping, as if evaluating the ship, before beginning to swim toward the hull. The first collision damaged the hull but did not sink the ship. The sperm whale backed away, swam some distance, turned around and attacked again, this time at greater speed. The second collision was fatal for the Essex. The ship began sinking immediately. Chase and Pollard agree on the basic facts but differ in interpretation. Chase described the sperm whale as acting with hatred and revenge, words a modern biologist would use cautiously but that accurately describe the observed behavior. Pollard was more restrained. He described the event as an attack without assigning motivation. What is certain is that the behavior was not defensive in the conventional sense. The ship had not harpooned that animal. The collision was not a navigational accident. The sperm whale swam directly toward the hull of an object that had not threatened that specific individual. Modern researchers of cetacean behavior have data that 19th century sailors did not have, and that data makes the stories of the Essex and Mocha Dick less impossible than they once seemed. Sperm whales transmit information culturally, learned behaviors passed down from generation to generation rather than instinctive ones. The sound dialect of a group is learned, not innate. Calves from groups whose adults were heavily hunted by whalers display behaviors different from calves in populations that were less exposed. This was documented in contemporary research on populations that experienced intense hunting during the 20th century. The spermaceti organ in the sperm whale's head, the one whalers wanted for its oil, has a function beyond producing spermaceti. It is the focusing organ for echolocation sound pulses. Sperm whales can concentrate sound pulses into directed beams with enough intensity to disorient or stun prey from a distance. Researchers have documented that sperm whales use focused pulses while hunting squid. An adult male sperm whale using focused sound pulses against the wooden hull of a 19th century whaling ship. There is no direct documentation of this, but the capability exists. What sailors described as the animal navigating with determination toward the ship may have included an acoustic component they could not perceive. Captains of whaling ships in the South Pacific between 1820 and 1850 began documenting something that had not been recorded in previous decades: sperm whales that responded to the appearance of whaleboats not by fleeing but by regrouping. The standard behavior of a group of sperm whales when whaleboats approached was to scatter, each animal fleeing in a different direction, making the pursuit of any individual more difficult. But in some heavily hunted regions, during certain periods, captains began recording groups that responded to approaching whaleboats by regrouping into formation, males on the perimeter, females and calves in the center. This formation, called by whalers the Marguerite formation because it resembled a flower with petals, was described as defensive. Males on the perimeter could intercept the whaleboats before they reached the females and calves. It was a formation that required coordination, communication between the animals in the group and a collective response to threat. Modern researchers have documented similar formations in cetaceans during stressful situations. The question raised by the 19th century data, without it being possible to answer definitively, is whether sperm whales in heavily hunted routes were adapting collective behavior in response to systematic hunting pressure. Whether they were learning as a group that the threat came from specific vessels and that a collective response was more effective than an individual one. This is not impossible for an animal with the cognitive capacity of a sperm whale. It is exactly the type of behavioral adaptation that researchers document in modern cetaceans in response to environmental pressures. Herman Melville was in New Bedford in 1841 when he boarded a whaling ship as an ordinary sailor. He spent 18 months at sea, deserted in the Marquesas Islands, spent time with local populations, was arrested for mutiny in Tahiti and eventually returned to the United States. In 1851 he published Moby Dick. Melville had read Owen Chase's account of the Essex. Chase's own son gave him a copy during the 1841 voyage. He knew the stories about Mocha Dick through Reynolds. He knew the culture of whaling ships from the inside, not secondhand. What Melville did with this material was transform the white sperm whale into a symbol of indifferent nature, of human obsession, of a force that has no motivation in the human sense but seems to have one because humans need to find meaning in everything that destroys them. Captain Ahab believes the white whale is malevolent. The narrator Ishmael is not certain. The whale says nothing, it simply exists as it always has, and humans project onto it whatever they need to project. It is possible that Melville was doing something more sophisticated than it seems, not romanticizing the whale as an avenger, but showing how humans interpret as intentional something that simply is. Ahab goes insane trying to find purpose in an animal that has no purpose, only behavior. But the cases of the Essex and Mocha Dick were real, and the question Melville placed into fiction is the same one that historical data places into reality. Where does animal behavior end and where does human projection begin? Commercial sperm whale hunting continued into the 20th century. The International Whaling Commission established a moratorium on commercial sperm whale hunting in 1986. After decades in which the global population of the species had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been before industrial whaling. Estimates vary, but researchers believe the sperm whale population was reduced by 60 to 80% during the period of intense hunting between 1800 and 1980. Animals that had survived decades of pursuit, that carried harpoon scars, that belonged to groups whose members had been systematically removed continued existing in the ocean while the industry that hunted them eventually declined. Sperm whales live up to 70 years. An animal born in 1820 that survived the intensive hunting of the 19th century would still have been alive during decades of the 20th century. Family groups whose collective memories, transmitted culturally, included decades of encounters with whaling vessels, continued navigating the same oceans after the vessels stopped hunting. What those groups carried in behavior, in responses to vessels, in patterns that had been adaptive during decades of hunting pressure, does not disappear immediately when the pressure stops. Culturally learned behaviors persist, dialects persist. The group memory of a cetacean with a 70-year lifespan and cultural transmission of behavior is a form of history that has no archive but still exists.